My name is Justin Chugg. I'm here with Sable. And today we have the privilege of hearing from Jay Papasan, who is the author of The One Thing. And many of you are probably familiar with some of Jay's works. He created the book, The Millionaire Real Estate Agent, The Millionaire Real Estate Investor, and The One Thing. His books have sold over 8 million copies. They've been translated into 31 different languages. They've also appeared on 500 national bestseller lists, and were number 1 on the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and USA Today. Jay was also named one of the most powerful real estate people, and Hudson Booksellers named The One Thing one of the 5 best business interest books. Jay is currently serving as the vice president at the world's largest real estate company, Keller. And on behalf of everyone on the call today, Jay, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to share with us some of your insights.
Thanks for having me. It's really my privilege. I've been talking about this book now for going on 5 years, and I'm still not bored with it. It's changed my life, and I love it.
Well, it's changed my life. We apply it almost every day here at Sable, and it's really been an inspiration to us. And before we get started, I was hoping you could provide some framework and some context about what led you to create The One Thing.
Well, I've been working with my co-author, Gary Keller, since, I guess, about the day after Labor Day in 2000, and we started writing together in 2002. And so we had already written multiple books, and we were working on a sales course, ironically, for first-year agents in Keller Williams. This would have been about 2008, and I had completed the course, and Gary wanted to write a really fun and forward to it. He took it home for the weekend, and he came back with an essay called The Power of One. And I remember it was 14 pages, and it had all of the big elements of the book. Figure out what your number one priority was, and for salespeople, that was lead generation. This is a sales course, and devote time block X number of hours a day. And it was so deep for such a short essay. I came back that Monday after he'd sent it to me that night, and I just said, Gary, this is a book. And he goes, I thought the same thing. And that essay is kind of what started the discussion. By the end of that summer, we had an outline and hired 2 full-time researchers. It took us about 4.5 years from then to actually have the book finished. It was our first non-real estate book. So we really proceeded with care because in real estate, we had some authority and validity. We didn't expect to have any outside of real estate. So we wanted to make sure it wasn't Jay and Gary's opinions, but research-based facts. So that's kind of where it started. I don't know if that's exciting or not, but it's just true. It started with an essay that turned into a book, and it's been now a big part of my life for about 11 years.
Well, I think the widespread acceptance of the book across all industries really helps illustrate the impact that it's had across the business world. One of the things that I loved about the book was the formula for success, which is really about focusing on that one thing. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful concepts from the book is how to figure out what that one thing is. I don't know if you could share with us a little bit about that formula and how to come up with that one thing.
Sure. We waited until about 7 chapters into the book to spring kind of the number one tool. But it's so simple. Our publisher didn't think that we had to build more credibility with our readers before we did it. But we called it the focusing question. And it came from years and years of coaching and consulting from Gary. It kind of evolved into a very specific question. So it's what's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary. And it's one thing, not a bunch. And I wasn't sure people would know their answers. And having taught this to tens of thousands of people in corporations, most people know what their number one is and actually feel a little guilty about not giving it more time. It's actually rare that we find people who can't find that answer. And when you only ask for one thing, there's really no place to hide. That was Gary's big aha. If you assign someone 3 tasks, they might focus on 2 and 3 and skip number 1. But if you tell them to only do one thing, and that is the number 1, most of the time they'll do 3 and 4 as well. And the rest of the question is really about how much leverage it has. And this is kind of the 80-20% principle, that 20% of what we do gets us 80% of our results. The one thing is kind of that on steroids. It's the 20% of the 20% of the 20%. Eventually you get to one thing. So it has to be the act of greatest leverage. What's the thing that we can do that will have the most impact towards our goals? And in our experience, again, people are pretty good at actually coming up with their answers. It's implementing it to where sometimes they have challenges.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the things that we need, that perspective to look back, take a step back and figure out what that one thing is and how it will impact everything else that follows. But I think the next biggest challenge, like you said right now, is to stay on track and stay focused on that. And there were some life principles in there that I think that are essential for anyone that's on the call. I was hoping you might be able to help share some of those, because like you said, I think all of us know what we should be doing, but most of us aren't focused on that. So what are some of the tricks that you guys figured out that helps us stay focused on that one thing?
It's funny, like most people don't really need another way to set goals. I just don't think that's a problem for them all, but like, it's really tough to have a relationship with their goals, like an ongoing relationship. So we've got a few hacks for that. I think the simplest one, it's very early in the book. We talk about taking your to-do list and converting it to a success list. So if you already are accustomed to working from a to-do list, taking the one thing and applying it to that list, you would simply just I usually get people to set like a 3-minute egg timer. I actually use Egg Timer. The free app, you can do Google Apps as well on your Chrome. Give yourself like 3 to 5 minutes. Go look at your list and ask, what are the things on this list that actually matter? What are the things that will actually matter, next week or next month versus all the stuff that you eventually have to do, which is what a to-do list is. And you separate those onto another list. Usually, in my experience, people will go from, say, 25 things down to about 5. And you get a much shorter list, like this is the real stuff that's on my list. And then you just ask that question. If I only got one thing done today or this week, what's the number one thing on this now short list? And that becomes your number one. And then you ask, well, if I got that done and I had more time and resources, what would be my number 2? And you proceed that way. And people who get in the habit of essentially just prioritizing their work so that they launch their day with that number 1, they launch their week with that number 1, even if they don't finish it, they tend to get very far ahead of the people who are just powering through their list. Because I'll be the first to admit, on my bad days, I look at my to-do list, and instead of doing the most important thing, I'm just crossing off the stuff I can cross off the fastest, because I just want the psychological relief of having a shorter list. And those are the days that I'm rushing around, and there's a lot of activity, but if I'm honest with myself, there's not much productivity. Productivity is working on your priorities, not just working. And so I try to remind myself of that. I have a coach who helps me remind myself of that. But the simplest thing is just to prioritize your task. We teach people to kind of look at that success list every morning and launch their day with it. And the missing piece to that, and this is just like the last of the tools part, and it may not be exactly where you're heading, Justin, but to me, it's like if we ask the question, how does that apply to real life, which is like taking our to-do list and giving them priority. And then when you know your number one thing, we just invite people to make an appointment with themselves to do it. We call it time blocking. And in our research, the most successful people don't just set appointments with other people, they set appointments with themselves. And they do it early in the day, and there's lots of research behind that. But early in the day, they set appointments with themselves to do their most important work. And we found some research in the American Journal of Psychology that people who set out an intention statement are about 3 times, and that's when and where am I going to do what I say I'm going to do, right? It's like a calendar invite. That's the intention statement. They're 3 times more likely to do what they say they're going to do. It goes from about a 35% success rate to over 90%. So the simple act of putting it on your calendar, like this is when I'm going to make my sales calls. This is when I'm going to do my prospecting. And it's from, say, 8 to 11 or 8 to 12 in the morning. Now, when someone says, hey, Justin, can you meet with me tomorrow morning? I love that when it's on your calendar, you have a built-in excuse. You can say, hey, I'm sorry, I've already got another commitment then. Can we do it after? And nobody is arrogant enough to ask you who that appointment is with as long as you don't volunteer that it's just with you. So that's the number one thing is let people know that you've already got a commitment, and they'll be happy to let you keep it. If you say, I'm working on something, people don't often respect that answer. They assume you're meeting with other people because most people, that's what their calendars are for. So that, to me, is kind of the success hack in a nutshell. And, in 7 quick minutes, the condensed version of the one thing. Is that helpful?
No, that's really, I think that's the key, is taking the time to actually be proactive and take control. I think all of us need to set an appointment with ourselves. And I think in the beginning you had mentioned that prioritizing is about perspective, taking a look at the different tasks and trying to determine which ones are important down the road rather than just right now. You also
That's right.
No, go ahead.
But yeah, you get perspective by stepping back and getting a bigger view. What feels urgent today probably won't matter next week. So that's the purpose of the exercise. You get that perspective, what here really truly matters, what's going to make an impact. The people who focus on those things do tend to advance faster than other people.
Yeah, and you also mentioned productivity a lot. And in the book, you talk a lot about productivity and profit, which are founded by purpose and priority. I don't know if you could touch upon briefly upon what you mean by purpose.
So there's like 2 levels of the one thing. There's my one thing, right, in terms of my number one priority. And then there's also kind of a big holistic sense, like, what's my calling? Why am I doing all this? What am I doing all of this for? And in our research, this was a hypothesis of Gary's that proved to be true. Purpose-driven companies, purpose-driven people tend to have a higher level of daily motivation, meaning that they actually show up more often than other people. And if you show up more often, you tend to do more than other people, right? And so you start adding that up. People who are purpose-driven also have an easier time saying no to stuff that doesn't matter towards their purpose. So your purpose, like for a business, it could be that you want to, there's a friend of mine that started a publishing company, and he's a big environmental guy. And he had a real conflict of interest between all the paper that the books were creating and the deforestation. So he created a whole program where every book he sold was allotted towards replanting forests. So that he aligned his goals with something that was deeper and more important to him. And it's crazy what people can connect. I can also look at, this is less purpose-driven and more about priority, but like Southwest Airlines was always the low-cost airlines, and that dictated all of their choices. What hubs they went into, the kinds of aircraft they used, all to save money. That's why they have the cattle call. But that very clear perspective about who they were and what they were doing allowed them to say no to all kinds of stuff and say yes to the things that aligned with it. So I don't know. You're familiar with the phrase like a person on a mission, a man on a mission. I'll take the gender out of it. A person on a mission. They tend to be head down and highly focused because they know why they're working. So we all stand to benefit of giving even bigger perspective. We're working like crazy. We spend more hours at work than we do with our family and our friends. What's it all for? And it's not as heavy as most people think, but we do need to give that some thought and at least have a directional sense of where we want to go. I'm doing this for freedom, right? I'm doing it for security. I'm doing it for some other passion. It can be a very broad scope, and then you can refine it as you go. But that purpose leads to a better sense of priority. People who work in their priority tend to be more productive, and the most productive business people are the most profitable ones. That's how those lined up, and they're very conveniently, I'll start with the letter P so that we could remember them.
Yeah, I think another word that starts with P is principle, where the purpose becomes a principle, which basically takes the decision-making out of life and allows you to work on autopilot and stay on track like what we talked before.
Well, I'll give you an example. This Monday, I was teaching at EntreLeadership. That's Dave Ramsey's organization. And I spent some time with one of their groups where they take their audience, right, the people who listen to that radio show and take financial piece, and they hook them up with realtors. And obviously, since I'm a representative of the largest real estate company in the world right now, they wanted me to mastermind with them. And what I figured out pretty quickly is they had a group that represented their clients, and those clients were the people who were asking Dave Ramsey to refer them to a realtor. And on the other side, literally of the table, there was another group who was managing the realtor pool, and their clients were the realtors. And they kept talking about their purpose was to help people get out of debt. And I just said, so who's your client? I've heard two people. You've got to make a clear distinction. If you're a purpose-driven company, I think you're bound to focus first on the people who are trying to get out of debt. And even though the realtors might pay you more money, right, because they aren't in financial straits, you have to focus first on the client who starts this process. It's only because they're here that you have an opportunity to even refer them to the realtors. So I think that they had a big aha that they hadn't declared their priorities. Someone had just stepped in and said, you've got to honor our principles and you've got to raise our profit. They didn't realize they'd actually potentially created a conflict statement. Does that make sense? I mean, I just dropped you right into another business.
That's a perfect example of how sometimes when we're focused on two things, they tend to divide and conquer our overall goals.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, with all of your business experience, what would you consider the one thing in terms of customer acquisition? What's the one thing when it comes to customer acquisition strategies?
Well, I'm privileged to work with the top 1% of 1% in our real estate company. There's about 100 of the top realtors in the world that convene 4 times a year, and we mastermind. And the reason they're in the room is they've mastered, we call it lead generation, and lead generation has 2 activities, prospecting and marketing. Prospecting is you directly going to the market to make offers, and marketing is you putting up a billboard, and that does it for you while you sleep. And we've seen the people who've had the most success in getting appointments. For us, our first, KPI that actually directly aligns with profit is the number of appointments we have. And so that's where our economic model starts. And the people who are most successful at winning that game are the people who begin with prospecting. And in, software enterprise, you're like, okay, how does that work? When you're actually getting on the phone with potential clients, the fundamental thing you want to do is make offers. Here's a value. In exchange for that, I want more of your time, right? So you can get deeper into that relationship. And the only way to know if your offers are working in that current environment is to test them. And it's very cost efficient, not time efficient, but it's very cost efficient to do that in person, because a good salesperson can hear the feedback and pushback, the objections, and work with it. And then you learn from the market in real time. The problem with marketing is that there's always a delay. You do some mailer, you do some web advertisement. You can get those metrics, but then you have to interpret them. So in our experience, the people who have the most success start with prospecting. They figure out what offers are working in the market today, and then they magnify those with marketing dollars. So the people at the front line, the people who are prospecting on LinkedIn and getting on the phone. And in our business, we're literally knocking on doors. Those are the ones who tend to understand the market and what's moving it the best. And the ones that then invest in magnifying that message tend to get the disproportionate market share. So does that translate to this audience? But that's what works in mine.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I've heard similar strategies. And I think that what you're saying is those that are on the front lines understand what works. And so before we amplify any type of strategies, we need to first understand what works, what resonates with our audiences, and then expand upon that and build upon that, rather than just constantly spending resources, time in areas that aren't really working.
Well, it's kind of reverse engineering where your 20% is, right? So if you want to believe in the 80-20, what is most effective? Where will we get 80% of the results? And the market usually will tell you. And you just have to be paying attention, and then you can put disproportionate resources towards that, or time if you're an individual. In our In our business, we call it the market of the moment. There's always a market of the moment, and it's changing constantly until all of your competitors can meet it. And that often is the place where you get your foot in the door, right? It's a fear, it's an anxiety, it's a skill that people are wanting. So you combat that with information and education, and you get into that conversation where you can then show them your full value proposition. But it changes constantly.
And I think one of the other takeaways is focusing on just that one concept as well. A lot of times we'll try to do 3 or 4 in our messaging and our conversations, but if we can focus on the most important point, it'll be much more effective than focusing on the top 2.
Yeah, and I'll tell you one more actual case study, and I absolutely don't have permission to use this company's name. I had to sign all kinds of waivers to teach in their company. But the reason I was in their company, a guy named Michael had picked up our book in the airport, and he was brand new to their sales team, and he was joining them at the end of the 3rd quarter. And his first time to meet this was in medical sales team, was for their 3rd quarter retreat where they were trying to rally to finish the year strong. This particular team had started off the year in the top 5 in a massive international company. They were one of the most top-performing teams out there. But by the end of the 3rd quarter, they'd fallen out of the top 25 teams. And they asked this guy, Mike, his opportunity was to help lead a part of the sales meeting. And he walked them through this prioritization exercise. As a result, they decided to focus on one client and one product. And not just one person, but the entire team. They went through that process of where they think they would get their best results, and they went all in. And they ended the year in the top 3. And because people saw that massive turnaround, like I ended up getting invited to go speak to their sales force, I think 11 times over the next 2 years, because they wanted to duplicate that. How do we get to think where the real priority is? And then instead of just saying, well, let's try that, put all your eggs in one basket, quite literally.
So that's everything that we try to do here at Enable and try to teach is that focusing and how that changes everything. So I know that we're a little bit over, and out of respect of everyone's time, we'll probably wrap this up soon. But I wanted to thank you, Jay, for joining us. We did have one comment while we were discussing. Peter was asking, he was saying, he tries to prioritize, but what happens is as he focuses on those top priorities, the list of to-do items expands exponentially, and he never gets to them because he's too focused on those top ones. And so I guess the question is, how do you deal with that? If you're so focused on that most important thing and everything else just kind of gets neglected and continues to grow in terms of to-do lists, how do you deal with that?
So we have 4 sections of the book towards the end, and they're the 4 thieves of productivity. And the first 2 show up right here. The first one is the inability to say no. If you can't say no to other people, those lists will pile up. And the other one is fear of chaos. I'm an introvert, so I usually don't worry about disappointing people because I don't need to spend more time with strangers, right? I'll say no. Mm-hmm. What I'm afraid of, because I've kind of got more of an engineering mindset, is I can't stand chaos. And so for me, the more time I spend focused on my one thing, the messier everything gets in my life. And that drives me absolutely crazy. I'm one of those people that will take a magazine and square it to the corners of the coffee table kind of people. But for me to be successful, I had to put that aside. One thing, and this is about how do we bridge the gap between these 2 places. If you're in sales, in our industry, the first hire we tell everyone to make is an admin help. In today's age, there are companies out there. My favorite is a company called 33 Vincent. They're U.S.-based virtual EAs that you pay for by the hour. There are a lot of companies out there like that. But if you are going to be really successful and you're working on commission, could you hire someone to start doing those to-dos for you? I don't want people to turn their economics upside down, but our top salespeople often will hire 2 admins before they hire anyone to help them with sales, because they know if they can just take all of those paperwork, those non-sales related tasks out of their hands and focus fully, that their funnel will keep getting bigger and they'll make more money, which will allow them to pay for more leverage. So I think people often get that intellectually, even if they're employed. My dad did medical device company, Smith Nephew Richards, for 15 years, and I validated this with him. Their top people, they didn't pay for them to get assistance, but their top people set aside some of their income to make sure that they had it. So lesson number one, this is good for entrepreneurs too. If you can, as you're becoming more successful because you're following these principles, kind of put a cap on your lifestyle, instead of going and buying the new Mercedes and getting the bigger condo that's furnished downtown, pause, hit the pause button, and start partitioning some of your income to invest in leverage. And that can come in the form of systems, right? That's what we're selling. Y'all are selling to companies, software leverage, right? This will save you money and save you time. You can also do that for human leverage. And the people who really do that efficiently are laying a bigger and bigger foundation so that when they do take that cap off, their income tends to explode. But you have to have a little bit more delayed gratification. I see people, we had a friend of my wife's, they went to lunch, and she's built a huge team on the backs of 5 amazing admins because she froze her salary. And she'll sell over $100 million in real estate this year. And it all became because for the first 3 years, she reinvested in her people so that she had an amazing foundation. So one of those guys in the office is like, come, I need you to coach me. I never can hire a good assistant or whatever. And he goes, I'll drive. And he wanted to drive because he had a brand new Audi. And they're driving, and this is absolutely a true story. And she's saying, well, why don't you just get an assistant? Why don't you get an assistant? He goes, well, I can't afford it. And she's like, dude, you're driving your assistant right now. And he had no idea. And he was so proud of himself for paying cash for this car, which is actually really smart for a luxury item. But if he had been a better business person, he would have kept driving the old car, and he would have had 6 months of an amazing, 35, 40 grand, whatever he put down on that, A4. I don't know how much an A4 goes for. I'm sorry, I'm not a car guy, but I'm assuming it's like 35, 40 grand. That would easily be half a year's salary for an exceptional executive assistant. There would be no risk in that bargain, right? And a right person will double or triple your productivity because they're taking all the stuff that you're not, one, good at and you don't like to do because you're a salesperson. You move all of that onto their plate, and they're happy. They love maintaining spreadsheets. They love copy editing documents, all the stuff that you hate, and you get to focus on the stuff that you're truly great at and build your business pipeline. So freeze your income, invest in leverage. You've just got to kind of bridge that gap. If you can't afford it right now, you may have to spend a few extra hours kind of walking that tightrope of knowing there are these fires burning out of control, but you're trying to capture that business so that you can afford to pay for leverage to start handling some of that for you. And it's incredibly liberating when you get to that moment of equilibrium where you have someone who understands how you work, can anticipate your needs, and put out those fires so you can focus on your one thing. That's a really magical place.
That's really powerful. I think that another thing to keep in mind is that executive assistants are essentially free because they're going to pay for themselves.
Yes. If they don't double your income, you've probably made a bad hire, or you're doing a poor job of managing them. If you're just dumping stuff on them, they should be taking your 80% so you can focus on the 20%.
And one last question that Pete was asking, I think you had mentioned, where might we find some of these executive assistants? I know I've sourced some through Upwork, and I think you mentioned, what was the company?
The 3 big ones. Upwork is great. I've hired a lot of specialists through Upwork for very specific stuff like the sales funnels, that sort of thing. There are people who are specialists, and you can pay them by the hour. It's not nearly as efficient as a full-time person. I believe one of those companies became Leverage.com. I haven't used them, but I had a friend that used them. So that's a once removed recommendation. And I personally used a company called 33 Vincent for the last 3 years. They have a very extensive training. They call themselves remote assistants versus virtual. And I use a Trello board to manage all of my EA's tasks. I'm on my second one. And what's cool is they have specialists. So if my EA doesn't know how to set up my Contactually, there's usually someone in their pool that'll step in and they'll allocate some of my hours towards them. So I don't own any of that company. I'm not getting any money. It's just it took me a long time to find a virtual service, and I like it because I just buy a block of 80 hours. I've got 2 months to use them, and then when they're gone, I get to renew them. So I'm never at risk for more than, I think the minimum block you can buy is 40 hours. But I'm sure you can do the same thing on Upwork and some of these other platforms. Just find someone who you can have a short-form communication with, be very efficient. In the beginning, manage to your standards. Make sure they understand what your standards are. The classic EA, they want to please. They really want to please. They hate failure. So if you let them know your standards and you're very clear about that in a kind way, they'll make a few mistakes and then they won't repeat them. That's a great sign of a great EA, is that they learn as they go, and then you can kind of just delegate more and more to them. I'm addicted, if you can't tell. This is like a soapbox thing for me. It's like, why don't more people have leverage?
No, I'm a huge fan of that. Of every good sales or business book, like 4-Hour Work Week, the one thing they talk about the power of an EA.